First of all, the museum and myself would like to respectfully acknowledge and offer thanks to the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui peoples upon whose land we are guests here today in Tucson. Thank you again for coming this afternoon. This is our last talk of our spring lecture series. These lecture series offered on a Thursday at 4 have been extremely popular, and we're going to be continuing them in the fall, where we offer and we invite faculty, researchers from the community on and off campus to come and speak to and speak with our current exhibitions. Our next one will be in the fall, September 12th, with Dr. Yumi Shirai and Dr. Carissa DeCindio. They'll be speaking about their collaboration in response to a community exhibition that derived out of Artworks, which is a community art center here on campus. So we invite you all to come back. All those dates will be on our website, so I don't expect you to remember, but kind of put it in your head. September 12th will be another fantastic talk. And I want to also thank the U of A's Commission on the Status of Women for its sponsorship of this evening's talk. I believe there is a clipboard circulating around here somewhere. If you want to sign up and get invitations to other events and other talks, possibly on exciting topics such as feminism, that is the place to sign up for. And thank you for your support. Thank you for all our members as well. Through the sponsorship through the Commission on the Status of Women and our members that we're able to have exhibitions such as feminism and events and talks such as these. If you are not a member or were interested in becoming one, please check with a staff member before you leave. We also have, before you leave, a clipboard in the lobby that you can sign up on our listserv and get invitations and announcements on upcoming exhibitions and events as well. I am super excited here today to be welcoming two people. Dr. Stephanie Troutman will be speaking to us for the bulk of today, but I'm also excited to be able to introduce our student curator, Katie Raymer, here in a second. Initially, Dr. Stephanie Troutman was invited to speak at the UAMA as part of our Thursday lecture series in order to provide perspective and voice to a topic that has historically been very myopic in its vision and agenda, and that is the feminism movement. This year, we were also excited to be able to continue to work with Dr. Troutman through her role as the faculty coordinator of the Wildcat Writers and director of the Southern Arizona Writing Project, which provides critical public engagement to Tucson schools. We toured 2 of those Wildcat Writer classes through our exhibition this year, using the visual art and poetry as vehicles for raising youth voice and speaking about identity in place and one's relationship to place. So we're incredibly honored to have her here at the university and to be able to collaborate with her this past year and to have her here today, and we hope that it's not the last time. One thing that I want to also remind everyone of is that this is a talk in relationship to the exhibition Feminism, which will also have a closing on May 2nd at 5 p.m. I am excited to be able to introduce Katie Raymer here, who is the student curator of the exhibition Feminism. That exhibition seeks to promote the individual as well as our similarities and differences. Works were selected from the museum's collection to portray societal constructs, various bodies and aesthetics, sexuality and gender, to reveal discrimination, to introduce various cultures, and to break down gender roles placed on men and women. Katie curated this exhibition as the UAMA's Marty and Ed Slowick curatorial intern. This internship allows the museum to actually pay a graduate student each year to research and curate works from the museum's collection, providing hands-on experience in the field of museum work for university students, and offers the museum and its visitors new perspectives, visions, and interpretations to its collection. Catherine Raymer is currently a master's student in art history at the University of Arizona, where she also received her bachelor's degree. She'll be attending Temple University in fall 2020 to work towards her PhD. Congratulations. And her research on depictions of lactating Madonnas and their relationship with medical and theological discourse in the Italian Renaissance, which is incredibly interesting, so ask her questions about it afterwards. However, Katie is interested in the role of gender, class, racialization, and the categorization of people in artworks. Please welcome Katie Raymer, who will introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Katie. So I'm here to introduce Troutman, and she is actually very much esteemed on campus as well as in the Tucson community as a whole. She's a scholar, a writer, a mentor, and an advocate for non-traditional and especially marginalized students. She's a voice for social justice in the community. So I'm going to just name a couple of her titles. There's a million, so bear with me. She is the Assistant Professor of Emerging Literacies in the Rhetoric, Composition, and Teaching of English programs in the English Department. She's formerly affiliated faculty member, in Gender and Women's Studies, Teaching, Learning, and Socio-Cultural Studies, Africana Studies, and the LGBT Institute. She actually just recently received an award for the Dr. Maria Teresa Vetta's Outstanding Mentor Award. I'm sorry if I butchered that. I didn't realize it was Spanish until halfway through. It's fine. And then some of her publications include Queering Teacher Education Across Contexts, and she's also the co-editor of the book Race and Ethnicity in U.S. Television, among many other publications. So I hope you guys are all as excited as I am today to introduce and welcome Dr. Stephanie Troutman.
Thank you all for being here today on a Thursday afternoon, late in the semester. Good to see folks. Today's talk is going to be the white female gaze, a Black feminist perspective on identity, affect, and representation. And so the way I planned the talk is to sort of move through a few stages. First, I want to kind of give an overview of the exhibit, and after that, I'll be going into just a brief abstract of the lecture, and then sort of introducing some of the images that we're going to see today that are going to be part of the lecture, theoretical frameworks, and then we'll do some applied work through these images. And I should start by saying, I'm more of a interactive teacher than a lecturer, and so that's my approach. And so the approach that I like to think about, that I incorporate, is really one that I call feminist pedagogical media literacy. And so it's really oriented toward pedagogy and sort of bringing that together with the theory and with literacy studies. And with that, I will begin. So just an overview of the exhibit. I'd like to start, what came to mind first for me is spending time in the exhibit. Have people been able to go over and see it yet? Feminism? Okay, well you should. Not today because we're closing after lecture, but come back and come to the small gallery and check out the exhibit. After you see some of the images, you'll want to do that. But the overview of the exhibit is, when I agreed to do this work, I had spoken at Chelsea, and I knew that a graduate student was the curator, which made me really excited because I love working with graduate students. And Katie and I, we met and we talked about her process and we talked about the images. And so then when I went into the space, one of the first things that sort of stood out to me, what came to mind for me was this quote by Virginia Woolf. And the quote is, "As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the world." And I felt that very much sort of encapsulated some of the things that Katie tried to do in the space, which is that in very non-typical white feminist form, she took a lot of care in preparing an exhibit that's very diverse. And not only in the types of artworks and pieces that are in the space, but in the kinds of things that the pieces are representing. And so Katie is the curator for this exhibit, and she's drawn together pieces that exemplify feminism through an intersectional lens and with intentional provocation. Some of the themes that are explored in the pieces are motherhood, nudity and sexuality, controversy, diversity. And one of the things I really appreciated about Katie's the care and sort of her curatorial eye was that she really felt strongly about the artists speaking for themselves. So a lot of the pieces have include just the artist statement So that really also, I felt like, was a great way to foreground the voices of the artists and not sort of over-determine them, right, in a particular way. And so some of the themes, I'd like to speak for a moment to the themes of the exhibit that are brought about by the feminist curatorial choices that Katie made in terms of the exhibit's thematic content. The artists and works displayed in the sort of aesthetic arrangement. So inside the space there are paintings and there are sculptures. There are both male and female artists represented. There's a lot of different kinds of entry points into these conversations that take up feminist concerns. And so a lot of the identity politics in the space are really interesting. And for me, the pieces signal a feminist imaginary that signals communities, societies, and global possibilities. So just really a shout out to you, Katie, for the cross-cultural connections and for the composition and the layout. Certain pieces are placed, are made to be very conversant with each other and with the community that they are sort of representing. Others focus more on social change, and then in some there are inter and cross-cultural connections. Masculinity again, sexuality, all these sort of different pieces of the feminist conversation I think are available in this space. So whatever your entry point is, there's something there to talk about. And hopefully you are enticed to come and see this exhibit now if you haven't already, as it is well worth your time and thought and offers many important opportunities for advancing and extending dialogues that seek to explore feminist concerns and issues. So thank you. Okay, so we'll segue into the main talk. So the abstract for this lecture is, rather than critique the exhibit, I'd really like to take this opportunity to guide you or to teach you a little bit about a handful of pieces from within the exhibit through a Black feminist perspective. That would be mine, not some grand narrative Black feminist perspective, because there are many, but just my Black feminist perspective. Using feminist theory, I'm going to kind of perform a bit of an applied pedagogical reading over 5 of the pieces in the feminism exhibit. I hope to engage you in a robust and maybe slightly challenging theoretical analysis of the works that I've chosen to explore with you today. And as I said, I'm more of a teacher than a lecturer, and so what I share today are my thoughts and interpretations in relation to some of the theories that I think get us into new spaces for critical thinking about imagery and identity. So also while we're looking at some of the images, I definitely, by no means are mine the only or best possible thoughts or interpretations of these works. I invite you to consider your own responses to the pieces and to the ideas as we look together. And one of the things that I'm really looking for, hoping to talk about is, or that I hope my talk and my observation will do, is to orient you or position you toward recognizing the reflections and refractions of socio-emotional dynamics and race relations between and among women. And so the artists who I chose to include, and there are many in the space, today will be Elizabeth Catlett, Margot Humphrey, Alison Sarr, Iona Rosile Brown, and Charles O. Golden. So we have the one outlier man, and I'll talk about that, who I included today. So we will go ahead and I'll bring up the images. So before I kind of get into the theoretical aspect that we'll be using to look more closely, I want to just briefly go through and let you see some of the images that we're going to talk about. So this is an untitled nude by Charles O. Golden. You have to pardon me, I cannot find a good picture of this online, and I had to take it with my phone. But you need to get an idea. The other images are better quality. And I also have included a few pieces that are not in the exhibit that are by the same artist, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what some of their work is doing, because I think it will matter when we start to talk a little bit about theory and perspective. So these are not in the exhibit, but this is the same artist, Brazil. Alison Saar, Sweeping Beauty, this is in the exhibit. And Alison Saar is one of my favorite artists. And here are a few other pieces by Alison that I think kind of work well and sort of speak together with the piece that's part of the exhibit. Margot Humphrey. So this piece is in the exhibit. It's quite amazing. It's probably one of my favorite pieces in the exhibit also. And here's a little bit more by Margot Humphrey. And Elizabeth Catlett, and this is a sculpture that's in the exhibit. So the sculpture is quite beautiful, and I think it doesn't really do it justice, but you get an idea. And a few more pieces by Elizabeth Catlett. And so, let me just go back to the title slide. And so originally when I started to think about the theoretical frameworks for examining these pieces, I was really thinking a lot about the work of Christina Sharpe, Keeling, Nicole Fleetwood, some other feminists who work with embodiment, Elizabeth Gross and Laura Mulvey, and then also the Afrofuturist thinker Natasha Wolbach. And then I decided as I was going through the pieces that really I wanted to focus in and examine some of the ideas that Nicole Fleetwood talks about in her book, Troubling Visions, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, which is a 2011 book that really is pretty amazing in the questions that it asks and the kind of interdisciplinary analysis that she does. And Nicole Fleetwood is a professor at Rutgers in American Studies, and she brings together a lot of different kinds of visual spaces to think about how we understand and know Blackness and race and the body. And so just a little bit of background for sort of an entry point into these theories, and mainly the theories that I work with here for this talk are feminist theory and performance studies. And again, focusing mostly on Fleetwood's work, but also a little bit, I'm going to start off and introduce a few ideas from Elizabeth Gross and Laura Mulvey. I kind of feel like you can't have a talk about women in art without talking about Laura Mulvey. Okay. And so, Laura Mulvey is a theorist, a feminist film scholar, and in her essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, which was published in 1975, but it's sort of one of those seminal pieces that brings together film theory, psychoanalysis, and feminism. And it introduces us to a concept that I think probably we take for granted now called the male gaze. At the time, though, it was very groundbreaking. People were not talking about this. And so the male gaze really gets us thinking about voyeurism and fetishism and the objectification of women and the way we see women represented visually, whether that's in film or photography or other kind of spaces where the subject is female. And so Mulvey talks about the gaze and really exposes that, and I think we definitely have seen people depart from that or sort of work with that idea in different ways. And part of that oppositional use of the gaze and rethinking the gaze is something that I'll talk about in relation to the pieces and through Nicole Fleetwood's work. The other kind of core concept that I think is important to understand at the beginning is also is from the corporeal feminist Elizabeth Gross, and she has a book 1994 called Volatile Bodies Toward a Corporeal Feminism. And in her book she posits that, quote, bodies do not exist outside of history, for it is produced in and through it. And I think a lot of these works really speak to these complicated histories of the artists, of the concepts that they're depicting, and then thinking about that and sort of the sort of social location and time period in which they were produced. Gross suggests that our bodies are inscribed on and perform history, which means that our lived experience is complicated by past historical events, and I think we can see a lot of that happening in some of the pieces. And so a little bit about Nicole Fleetwood and her book, Troubling Visions, Performance, Visuality, and Blackness, 2011. So in the book is interesting because Fleetwood really starts with a personal anecdote about introducing one of her white friends during her Nicole's black, introducing one of her white friends to her grandmother. And her grandmother having this strange reaction to meeting her friend, something that Nicole noted at the time but really didn't really understand and sort of continued to think about. And at some point, she asked her grandmother, she said, that time when I was a little girl and I brought my friend and you met her and you weren't yourself. And her grandmother's response was that she felt that Nicole's friend looked at her and as someone who was fat, black, and ugly. And that was a quote. And so that kind of stuck with Nicole throughout her life as she was thinking about the way women are depicted, the way women experience their bodies, and the way we experience these intercultural exchanges and how we're feeling or how we are interpreted by someone else's look or gaze or posture. And so thinking through those dynamics of race, and then of course as Nicole became a scholar and began to come into contact with discourses that confirm or reaffirm that black women are seen in particular kind of ways, she got very interested in exploring why it is that there are certain kinds of dominant stereotypes and depictions of black women, and how that shaped and influenced her in ways that she was unaware of when she was younger, and her grandmother, and that whole sort of context. So in the book she's focusing on considerations of race, gender, privilege, and spectatorship, what we should know about the sexualized and gendered black body in relation to visuality and subjugation of black people in the United States. And she argues in the book against a continued reliance on the power of the icon and the desire for a single representation of blackness in visual discourse. And so I think what I've tried to do is, keeping that in mind, pulling some pieces from here, and you've seen some of them now, that do that work, right? That move away from a singular or a single representation of blackness in visual discourse. A variety of blacknesses and bodies in the space of these images. Also, she's looking to trouble the iconographic while demonstrating the potential that non-iconic images, the potential of non-iconic images for making visible those who have been obscured from Black American history. So I think the other piece here is that we're used to seeing particular kinds of black subjects, and maybe a limited range, not so limited anymore. I think social media and other kinds of technologies, right, have broadened a lot of what's possible in a lot of the images that we see. But even still, I would argue that in particular kinds of fine art spaces, that there tend to be some reverberations of some of those old traditions and traditional subjects. And so some of the questions that Nicole Fleetwood asks and that I think we can think about and think through as applied to these pieces, she asks, how does one come to know subjects as black or even more specifically as African American? What are the visual markings that make certain subjects legible as Black? So these are things we're going to keep in mind as we return to some of the images. Another idea that she's working with is the concept of the Black performing subject. And so, as central. And she argues that Black visibility and legibility is predicated upon staged racial and color marking through character type and narrative. And so when we look back at these pieces, I want us to sort of talk about what character type we see and sort of what the narrative might be, or how that piece, how the aesthetics of the piece situate us toward a particular narrative. She also talks about the ways that that the representations mark the psychological, personal, and social and political effects of Black female subject formation within an economy of color that's always reliant upon the optical. So we're thinking about the ways that Blackness is very much about optics and images and how we see those things performed and marked on the body, which I think gives us sort of, connects us back with Gross and her ideas of corporeal feminism and the way things get enacted through, and histories are enacted through the body. She also works with a couple of concepts. One is excess flesh. Black women performing hypervisibility. And this is, she talks about this as something that happens when cultural producers take up dominant representations of Black women in visual culture and public discourse to construct new modes of operation. So hypervisibility, this interesting concept wherein you're unexposed, underexposed, and always exposed. And so this is one of the sort of spaces that I think Black women often find themselves in, underexposed and always exposed. And so we can kind of talk about how that operates in some of these pieces, and how this can be used as a tool of resistance, but also it's something that has to be acknowledged, and it's sort of not easily escapable, although I think we can see it being used in different ways toward different ends. She also talks about the enactment of the gaze, so thinking back to Laura Mulvey's ideas about the gaze being this male gaze that objectifies women. One of the things that Fleetwood is doing is playing with the idea of the gaze and talking about the enactment of it as something that doesn't necessarily attempt to heal or redress the naked, exploited, denigrated Black female body, but understands the function of this figuration in dominant culture. And I think we can see in some of the images the ways that that's working. She calls this a productive look, the gaze, when it's used in the context of Black female subjects. As a productive look that lays bare the symbols and meanings of this weighted figure. And she also goes on to theorize around Jose Esteban Muñoz's concepts of disidentification, which I think we can see in some of these as well. And disidentification works as a productive look that is within and outside the dominant public sphere simultaneously. And so, with that, and we return to some of these ideas as we look. So the first piece that I wanted to pull, so I decided in terms of trying to think through the relationships between white feminist understandings of identity, Black feminist representation, and these things sort of interacting or coexisting in the space of this exhibit. Even though there are many other kind of cultural and ethnic pieces, I chose to really focus on that sort of Black-white binary, in part because of some of the tensions that really just arise when we say feminism. And I think that it's one of the things that Katie keyed into. If you look at the way feminism is displayed, it's F, asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And nism. And, Katie did that because of the ways in which, feminism is sort of this fraught term. We still, even many years later, are up against a lot of misconceptions about the term. And I think part of the reason that, some of these things have resurfaced is given our current political context. I think really exacerbates and takes us backward in our ability to understand and converse about some of the things that feminism offers us as a movement, as a space that's produced theory, as a space for scholarship and activism. We're now back to sort of, I wouldn't say ground zero, but we're definitely, I feel very 1990s in some of the conversations that I have about feminism now because of the way our current political moment, historical moment, positions things about gender and race and identity. And so understanding that for me and within an academic context particularly, feminism is about many things, but one of the things that always seems to come up when we're confronting that history in relation to the now is about whose voices and who's represented and who is excluded. And even more most recently in thinking about some of the women's marches and things that have been organized, locally here in Tucson, because of the Latinx and Chicana communities, here there's a struggle with white feminism in this space about who gets to talk about immigration and who gets to lead some of these local movements around community activism. And I think, for me, it just automatically, I begin to also think about these early debates in the 70s and the 1980s about between black feminists and white feminists. And I still think that there's, those struggles exist. I think people are trying to do a better job. I think we have more information and more resources to do that work. But that black-white binary is always interesting to me in conversations about feminism. And so, in this particular picture, I decided I wanted to look at all of the African American artists in the exhibit and or depictions of African American women in the exhibit. So this turned out to be the outlier of, this is the one image that is of a black woman, but is produced by a white man. And so while the artist isn't necessarily the focus of my talk, this particular piece I thought was really interesting in that it kind of, you can see, right, the spectacle of the male gaze in it, and I thought that was really interesting, particularly in the context of this artist who was a Tucson artist. Didn't come from Tucson, but came here and founded an arts school. And I was going through all these other images produced by this artist, and this is the only one that is like this, at least of the ones I came across. It's all like Southwestern cowboys and, just other kind of more local Southwestern communities, right? And so the fact that there is this one piece of an African American woman, I began to really have a lot of questions about this, who is this woman? Was this happening in Tucson? And, somebody posed for this? Imagine this woman? So again, I love the piece in that it's really beautiful and that it really centers this black woman. But at the same time, I think because of that sort of traditional form of the nude, and there's a particular, way in which she's very passive, right, in the photo, that I had to be okay, so I see the male gaze at work, but I also think this is quite a beautiful image, right? So we're sort of in that space of, what does it mean to be hyper visible, and then also, but yet this is the only piece, at least from what I could tell, that even engaged this kind of subject by this artist. So just sort of thinking about these, again, going back to Fleetwood's questions, how does one come to know subjects as black, or even more specifically as African American? What are the visual markings that make certain subjects legible as black? And I mean, we can definitely see in this, the black flesh We're very aware that this is an African-American woman. And even sort of this idea, right, to place this very kind of a classic nude structure and composition, but with these really interesting colors, like these very bold colors, and it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a cluttered space around her too. So I was thinking a lot about that piece, and again, you'll note the difference, I think, as we look at the other pieces, not only in the form and the composition, but also the ways in which the female subject is positioned. And I think that that has a lot to do with the fact that the other artists are women, and they're Black women, and so they are engaged in a different kind of making process about that Black feminine identity, I believe. This image, interesting as well, by Rosiel. This image is, I thought was particularly interesting as well because it's one of the few images of a man painted by a Black woman in the context of this exhibit. The other pieces focus on women and women's bodies. This piece focuses on a masculine body. And you'll notice in this picture, and this really, you have to go see it because this doesn't do it justice. This looks almost like a sketch. This is really a beautiful, vibrant painting, and this whole yellow piece in the back is gold. And so, like, it made a really good glare when I took a picture of it. It's beautiful. But thinking about this idea of moving, right, the Black female producer, Black female as artist, as producer, moving outside of some of the typical spaces. And I think this is one of the things that Fleetwood wants to talk about, is the way in which Black women, as cultural producers, she really wants to move away from this idea of iconography and this really staged and iconic and classically composed kind of images, right? Like he's talking about, we can appreciate Annie Leibovitz, but what are certain other kinds of images telling us about identity and about race, and how are we looking for and at those other works? And so this work, to me, kind of embodies, or in some ways exemplifies, if Black women, in their imaginaries and in their understandings of culture, outside the self, but in relation to the self, what kind of things might be produced. And I think one of the things that makes Rosiel's work very distinctive is that it's examining, Blackness in Asian culture. And that's something that's sort of, I would say it's under-theorized, it's under-studied, and so it's also underrepresented. And so it's definitely quite striking to think about these messages of the body and the performance of race. And when Fleetwood's asking us, well, how do we know, what we know about Black bodies, and how is race marked on the body? In this picture, we can really kind of see, this is an Asian man or an Asian person, but we also see drug box. We also see African symbols, right, in the print, in the fabric. We see he's a DJ, potentially, or there's some DJ cultural reference there, right, around the turntable and the headphones. And so we're really being asked to think about this way in which Blackness gets marked on the body or produced. And in this context, as sort of thinking about cultural appropriation of Blackness outside of an American lens or a Western context. So I find that to be a really interesting kind of play on some of these ideas of identity and how that's marked. And I wanted to, in some of the other images, which are not part of the exhibit, but I thought also, kind of speak to these same kind of ideas around thinking about Blackness and bodies in different ways, in ways that are not necessarily iconic, but in ways that get us closer to understanding a range of ways that Black women exist. And again, through hairstyles and other kind of, right, performances of identity and race. So Alison Starr, Sweeping Beauty, and thinking about this, again, relying on some of Fleetwood's ideas about Black women as cultural producers and what happens when Black women are in charge of the ways in which female identity gets represented. And so here, this idea of hypervisibility, underexposed, always exposed, there's not necessarily a solution to that. And so here, the play on words and Sweeping Beauty, but also, you can't see too well in this image, but so her hair is a broom. And so she's hung upside down, right? So she's already sort of turned upside down, and we're thinking about this embodiment, right? So if we compare this nude to the first one that we saw, that was by Golden, we see really something different happening around a critique of what it means to embody, femininity, and to be really thinking about exposure. I think, we're probably more comfortable in looking at like the nude that's really classically positioned and more inviting, right, and more passive. And in this, we have to like furrow our eyebrows and be like, why is she upside down? Why is her head a broom? Like, why is her hair like sweeping the floor, essentially, right? And thinking about it as, and then also, right, there's a maternal component here as she appears to be pregnant in the body. And so thinking about the way that we sort of sometimes like to detach women's actual embodied experiences from the way that visual pleasure works, right? This is not necessarily an image that gives us visual pleasure, but asks us to think about or imagine the way that under capitalism, women are also, that we have particular kinds of gendered expectations and utilities that we perform. And so a lot of Alison's work really is trying to look at the ways in which race and gender roles are operating in the experience and identities of women. And she does a lot of things around hair, and she does a lot of things that kind of play with racial identity. She herself is racially mixed. And even in this picture, right, you can see at the bottom there's sort of a black shadow across the face. And so thinking about what happens when we move away from these sort of either classical or more iconic staged images of what women's experiences and embodiments mean. And so here are just a few other ones of Alison Starr, where she's really thinking about, again, you can see the body, hair in the first two, this upside down woman, right, as sort of this means of like working all the things that women are asked to sort of work through in establishing our beauty and our utility and being respected and living in our bodies. All of those things are sort of depicted here as well. So Margot Humphrey, the history of her life written across her face. So this image, again, this doesn't do it justice, you really have to see it. But again, moving away, right, from sort of this really beautiful, is more beautiful and passive, to something that's like really active, really busy, and kind of are accustomed to, particularly in Adam and Eve one, which some of her work is really controversial. She has another painting that's called The Last Barbecue, and it's a reimagining of The Last Supper through blackness, and there's different elements of black culture in that painting. And so these ideas of taking histories of religion and race and kind of remixing them and helping us to like expand our thinking about how we encounter blackness and how we know what it is or what it could be, and seeing it in different ways. And then finally, Elizabeth Catlett. And I think it's important to note that Elizabeth Catlett comes out of the Black Arts movement. And so for those who maybe not as familiar with the Black Arts movement, that was a period that sort of overlaps a bit with Black Power. It's post-civil rights. So it's somewhere after civil rights and before Black Lives Matter. So, in that in-between where it seemed like nothing was going on, Black Arts movement was doing, really using art toward political ends, and through music, through jazz, through poetry, through theater, Amiri Baraka, so many others. But Elizabeth Catlett was really using fine art in her practice of Black arts revolutionary work. And she's a really interesting artist. I have a quote from her that I wanted to read. And this is not from this exhibit, this is from another exhibit called Figuring Black Power. And so painting and sculpture became powerful vehicles for protesting violence and communicating the urgent message of Black liberation. Artist Elizabeth Catlett said, quote, "Art for me, now, must develop from a necessity within my people. It must answer a question or wake somebody up or give a shove in the right direction, our liberation." And so it's interesting to think about, again, you know, motherhood, discourses of motherhood often, you know, are confining, or they tend to be more narrowing. Oftentimes motherhood and liberation are not seen as in relation to one another. But I think for Catlett, you know, she's really picking up on these important ideas within the Black Power movement, that Black communities matter, that Black children matter, that Black mothers matter, that these communities and spaces deserve better resources and more freedom, and focusing on something as sort of, I don't know, the theme of motherhood through art has been, you know, as Katie was talking about her work earlier, you can trace it way back, you know, and all kinds of different depictions of this. And for Catlett to kind of take that up in a way that's very much about Black motherhood, and about Black children and reproductive justice and community justice is pretty radical, even though we might not think of motherhood as a radical space. I argue that she is taking that and pushing it and even depicting it, right, in these beautiful, like working out of like sort of marble, which is a very traditional sculptural material, but doing that, you know, with an eye toward Blackness, doing it with an eye toward some sort of like African technique and things that you can see in the aesthetic is really important. And she did many pieces that focused on mothers and children and really, again, pushing toward understanding motherhood as a potentially radical space, not sort of this passive, my baby's on my lap, we look like angels, Renaissance kind of relationship. And I think, again, this is some of the kinds of iconography and some of the kind of work that Fleetwood is, that some of her theorizing enables us to see these things and engage just sort of beyond our initial response to aesthetics or beauty or personal connection. And so hopefully in looking at these pieces, you know, we're thinking through what it means to view the workings of Blackness as visually knowable. And I think in the end, I'd like to just kind of think about a little bit some of the things that Ytasha Womack, an Afrofuturist writer, she's the writer of Black Quantum Futures. I think Afrofuturism sort of enters this discourse in the space of, you know, Womack talks about how Afrofuturist representations promote the imagination as a tool of resistance, creativity, mysticism, agency, otherworldliness, reimagining identities, activism, and social change. And I think that that's sort of, right, some of these things are embodied or are on display within Katie's exhibit. And I think that if we are to think about Black art or the future of it, or to think about and imagine the ways in which these different cultures and race and those dynamics are working, that Afrofuturism also gives us a really interesting way to sort of look and move through the way we are configuring race and are thinking about our identities and our communities. Thank you.